Welcome to another episode of Two Average Joes. I'm Joseph St. John's. And to remind everyone, especially new listeners, I have spent about 30 years in law enforcement. I was a captain in the Newport News Police Department, and then for a few years, I was chief in Columbus, Mississippi. So got a little bit of experience, a little bit of knowledge on police work and crime in general there. So hopefully as we go through this case of John Norman Collins and the Michigan murders, give you a little bit of insight on what I've learned over 30 years. And my partner here, Robert Joey Baker. How about you?
Yeah, Robert Baker. I'm a practicing attorney in Michigan. Have been since 1997, been licensed. I primarily do criminal defense and litigation of many different types, civil. I've had interestingly, we're getting to the meat and potatoes of why we started this podcast, which is the third murder in the Michigan murders, which is the Jane Louise Mixer case. And this one's a little different because we're going to do a couple of different episodes on the victim and then the person who was eventually convicted of this crime, and then the person or persons that we believe surmise that actually did do it. So
yes.
Where would you like to start, Joe?
Well, this is kind of the beginning of why this podcast started. And to put it and frame it in context for everybody, this is one of those situations where you cannot discuss the victim, Jane Mixer, without understanding the two people before her, and the people after him, the young women that would be killed after her.
True that.
And that's real important. So it's kind of like when we balance this out, we want to respect Miss Mixer. That's number one. We want to really respect her. But to put her position in, we're going to do the usual couple of episodes. We'll do one on Gary. Then we're going to go and do the other victims so you can start to see this. And then we will circle back around and really focus on this case, because this is really where Robert got super involved in this, and where we will probably need to bring in a guest or two to discuss some of this. And probably, if I'm correct to say, is probably the murder that you have the most contact with of knowing, because of the fact that you did know Gary and you did deal with him professionally.
That is true. So just to recap, this is the third in a string of murders that occurred, which is called different names: co-ed killers, Michigan murders, several books written. You'd have to look. I don't know whether we'll put it in the bottom or.
Yeah, they'll be in there. The books are always in there.
Okay, so several books written about this, but there was a murder in 1968 or 67, the first one, the second one in 68. And then almost a year later, this third victim is abducted from the law school of University of Michigan. And I'll get back to that. But these three murders, they're saying, specifically this one, when I say they, it's the law enforcement said this one was different. Okay. And the differences, and we'll get into the really detailed differences, are what they're saying is that this Miss Jane Louise Mixer was a first-year law student in the University of Michigan. She was living at the Law Quad, which is actually across the street from the University of Michigan Student Union, and which is also not very far from the Theta Chi fraternity, which we've seen in the last two episodes is a reoccurring theme, and it is a reoccurring theme in this one, which we'll get into also. But so Miss Mixer, she was dating or going to, she was actually engaged to be married to a gentleman who was a professor's aide at University of Michigan, and I believe his name was Weissman. And as Joe will tell you, usually the boyfriend is the first.
Yeah, that's going to be the first person you look at. That is
right.
Don't take it personal.
Right.
You're number one on the list.
Right. So, and this guy, and I don't want to call him a piece of work because I don't know the gentleman. I'm sure he became a stellar individual, but evidently, Miss Mixer was going to go to her home, which she was from Muskegon, Michigan, which for those of you who don't know it, that's right on the coast of Lake Michigan, on the actual west side of Michigan. Mm-hmm. And her father was a dentist, and I don't know what, I think her mother was a homemaker. And so she had put her name on a ride board, which was a thing that was done. And Joe and I have talked about it on previous episodes. Don't beat up the victim in this case. That, him and I both, or at least I did, thumbed back in the day.
Yeah. It was normal.
It was a normal thing. It was normal. Yeah. So she put a ride request on the ride board to go back, and I believe was it for Thanksgiving or was it for Easter? Thanksgiving.
That one, I'm not sure.
I think it was Thanksgiving that she was going to go back. But back to her fiance, evidently he had a car and they were going to meet there, but he did not let her use the car because evidently she returned it the last time without putting gas in it.
Yes. I'm going to let that one hang.
Right. I don't know where to go with that.
I'm neither going to criticize nor am I going to defend that. I'm just going to let that hang. That's just a fact you have to deal with.
Right. So she put this placard or a little card on the board and said, "This is Janie. I need a ride to Muskegon for," I believe it was Thanksgiving. And the date was, I believe it was March the 20th was the date. And she had put it up a couple of days.
If it was June, it'd be East. If it was the March, that would be East.
Okay. So you're right. So she put the card up there, and then she had stayed the day before with her fiance at his apartment, evidently. And then he had dropped her off, and she was supposed to be picked up at 6:30. I believe at 7:00. She had called, or her fiance had called her, and she was still there and had not been picked up. And supposedly a gentleman named David Johnson was the person who was going to come pick her up. So she is eventually picked up, and she doesn't arrive when she was supposed to, which was about an hour and a half ride, I believe, hour and a half to 2 hour drive to Muskegon from Ann Arbor, which University of Michigan is. And her father becomes very desperate, and he goes directly to the police and tries to get them to do things which they were reticent to do, because I think there's some kind of thing in law enforcement, Joe, you can correct me, that
it's not there anymore. We'll look at stuff pretty quickly. But back in the day, it was 24 hours.
Yeah. So they didn't want to do anything, but he had some clout as evidently a doctor or dentist in Muskegon, and he got, I believe, the sheriff from Muskegon to put some boot in some asses at the Michigan State Police, and they started looking pretty quickly. Okay, so the David Johnson character is very interesting because John Norman Collins, who we had talked about in the last episode, he had a fraternity brother in the Ypsilanti Theta Chi fraternity that was that him and David Johnson had problems together, probably with Mr. Collins' thievery.
Yeah, his lack of moral character.
Right. But anyway, so she disappears, and then the next morning she is found at Denton Cemetery on Route 10, I believe, which was heading out towards Detroit. And it was en route to John Norman Collins' mother's lived in Centerville. So if you were going to drive to Centerville from Centerville, something like that, out by Detroit, you would have to drive by this Denton Cemetery. And she was found. She was placed on a grave. She was on her back. She was not sexually assaulted. She had her pantyhose and her panties down. She had a menstrual pad. She had been shot twice in the head with a .22, which will become important. And she was also strangled with a nylon stocking. Okay, not pantyhose, but a specific stocking, which will also become important. Anything you want to throw in there, Joe?
No, I think you have that. I think that I believe a young boy actually found her because they found
A neighbor child who was on his way to the school bus
Mhm.
had picked up. She had a bag with a gift in it and some other things, and he had picked it up and brought it back to his mother, saying, "I don't know why this was sitting out in front of the cemetery."
Mhm.
And his mother looked on the bottom and found blood, and that's when he had already gone to school.
Mhm.
And she called the police. So the police come out and find Miss Mixer at this grave. Now, I've been to that grave. I actually went out there with my private investigator, Mike Manning, a couple of years ago. He was doing a seminar out there, and we went actually to the grave. It is right off of I believe it was US 10. There's now an actual interstate, which wasn't there in 1969. But it would have been the main thoroughfare to go through to Detroit from Ypsilanti or Ann Arbor.
Yeah. I think it's good to point out this was not a place where you had to find it. I mean,
you didn't, and it was known as a lover's lane, okay, which comes into play. I think the second victim was put at a lover's lane also.
Yeah. I think that I think there is some reoccurring themes. I don't want to say the crime is a reoccurring theme because I believe there's great differences, but you have to remember space and time. I think the fact that people got rides, not abnormal. People going to Lover's Lane, not abnormal.
Right.
You know? I mean, I don't think that either one of those things are, maybe looking now where people are a lot more cautious, especially if you're younger and watching this, and you're like, wow, we've been warned not to do all that. Yeah, just because people were victimized.
Mm-hmm.
People didn't have that. Okay. Here's something to blow your mind. The average person in America wasn't really driving cars till the 40s and 50s. So actually transportation was a fairly new thing and people just really made some bad choices. That's without being critical.
And knowing the culture change that we were going through, free love, Vietnam War raging. We've talked about it before, but
yeah, I mean, and I've mentioned it many times. So you have to keep that in mind that, when you go back into time, understanding, I think you just said that the interstate wasn't there at the time, right?
it wasn't.
In most places, the interstate wasn't there. You went through towns. You went through the straight shot, so to speak, as back in the day. And so there's nothing unusual that this person would have known where this was.
Mm-hmm. Right. And this is where, this is a very complex case. And I was kind of telling Joe, I don't feel as prepared as I should be because I have personally 2 banker's boxes full of documentation because I was tangentially involved in the person who was eventually convicted. After he was convicted, he had approached a company that I owned a little piece of to do some PR when he was up on appeal for the Michigan Supreme Court. But Joe and I, we have kind of run parallel. We're not saying who the killer is. We suspect, and we're using all of our intuition and the circumstantial evidence that we see and we find. But basically, we're relying on 50, 60-year-old evidence that's in 5 or 6 different books and people's interviews and things like that. So that being said, Miss Mixer was either killed by John Norman Collins, who was eventually convicted in 1969 of Karen Sue Beineman murder by a jury in Ypsilanti or Ann Arbor. I think it was Ann Arbor, Michigan, Washtenaw County. Or she was killed by Gary Leiterman, who was convicted in 2005 of the murder of Jane Mixer. Or she was killed by another person or another group of people.
Right.
So those are kind of the three options that I guess, is there any other option you can think of?
I want to stop you there because I think it's real important as we build, you got to give people a background. So when we build on this, you'll see where we're going. Up until, and I don't want to get lost on this DNA test that was done on Gary.
Right.
Because we're going to have a whole episode on that. And I don't want to get lost from Jane Mixer. But up until this, and he gets charged, everybody on the planet included her in as as a person who was killed by John Norman Collins.
Yes.
Okay. That includes law enforcement.
Yes.
Okay. So got to keep that in mind. We're not going backwards and going, I don't know how anybody thought it was John Norman Collins, because everybody thought it was John Norman Collins. And I don't want to get totally lost on this DNA, but when we present that, which will probably be an entire episode,
yeah,
you're going to see that is not as simple as you think. And I'm pro DNA. It's a great tool. It put many of guilty people in jail, but it's also worrisome when you hear the rest of this story. So we'll just give you that in there, but there'll probably be a whole episode where we just talk about the DNA that placed him there.
And remember, this is 1969. There is no DNA.
Right.
There's DNA, but it's not discovered and being used as a tool yet.
Right. And then when we say DNA, we don't mean DNA in the sense of your DNA. We mean it so when we say DNA, we mean that as a crime fighting tool. Another interesting thing that came up later, and we've seen this map before if you've been with us on other episodes, there was also this giant continuation where obviously some people that went backwards in time and wanted to, and this is right here, Mixer, and where she's found compared to the other bodies, to make a gigantic difference of where she's located. But it's important to remember this is on the way to John Norman Collins' mom's house. And I also get worried about maps, and everybody, I'm going to just do my little circling thing. Maps are great. Okay. I'm for using them, and you can put little pins in them and give you an idea. But when you have to put the map bigger, like the state of California, where we know he murdered somebody, okay, you begin to understand the limitations. Okay. Right. And actually, and I think, Robert, you are way better at knowing the landscape of Michigan. I've been there twice, and I enjoy its beautiful place, great people, mm-hmm. But I do not claim to have any great knowledge of the landscape.
Right.
But is this really a gigantic area, or is it a lot closer than what some people have made it sound?
Well, if you look at the center down near the bottom where it says Ypsilanti, mm-hmm. and then there's a Y in the road, do you see that?
Yes.
That's approximately where John Norman Collins lived. Okay. Mm-hmm. So remember that Eastern Michigan University is there. Ann Arbor, was where Miss Mixer was taken from, is upper left, probably closer to the two skeleton and the shell.
Right.
Two shell bodies were found. So, but if you want to say something who's out of the realm, I would look at Alice Callum.
Right. I would
agree. Who is way the heck up north and west, right?
Right here is Alice.
Yeah. And so they're saying because Jane was, and notice, because we made a big deal about it in the last two episodes, that both of those were placed in different jurisdictions. This one's in Wayne County.
Right.
Which is a different jurisdiction from the other two. So even in Earl James's book, Catching Serial Killers, he said, hey, there are differences in this case. And it was mostly because, so this happened on March the 20th, and she was found on the 21st. Mm-hmm. And we won't get into it, but remember, or we will remind you, 2 days later, another woman is killed, and she is brutalized, beaten with a belt, beaten with a log, and we won't go into all the brutality that occurred, but it was a frenzy beyond the first two frenzy killings.
Yeah. I think that's always been my concern, and it's kind of like I'm not against maps, right? It's just this is the problem with humanity. Okay, it's not an insult towards anybody. It's just a fact. Is you go and you look here with this person, Mixer, and you say she's here, and you can start acting like you're reading this map like you are a great map reader. But in actuality, he's moving things, or the person, in our opinion, is moving it from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. None of these rides from one place to another, from Ypsilanti to either of these locations, is a 3-day drive. They're all within striking distance, as they would say. And I think that at times we can get very focused on these maps without realizing it's probably more important to realize he was going from jurisdiction to cause problems.
Yeah.
And we have said it in the past, and we will say it again. He was a police junkie. He had relative corporal on the Michigan State Police. He hung out with police officers. He would have understood the problem he was causing. So, again, not putting down maps. We use them. We pinpoint them. You can draw up some conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to keep everything under perspective. Okay. Sometimes I worry about with maps, and I worry about with stuff when they're done. When a map is done originally, it is to create a visual so that investigators can see what they're doing. Okay. It is a visual to follow the process of what is happening. A lot of time in hindsight, people will look at the exact same map, take what they believe already, and then apply the map to it.
Yeah.
See, and that's one thing in human nature that you have to be careful about. And that is not to take your perceptions, look at a map or, a song lyric or something, and then apply it to an entire thing when in actuality, that was just your opinion and you were looking for something. So we all need to be careful of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think the fact that you brought up that she was in another jurisdiction once again is probably more important than just picking out map spots. I think there was a correlation to that, and that's really important. And here's what's weird. This is 1969, right?
Mm-hmm.
That would be a problem. In 2022, that could still be a problem.
True.
And I don't want to get lost, but you go back into some investigations, even school shootings, where you've seen that jurisdictional problems reared their ugly heads really quick.
Yeah, I'm sure you dealt with it your whole career, didn't you?
Yeah, not saying it's right or wrong. Jurisdictional problems can be big problems.
Back then, for sure.
Yeah, make no mistake. And it could creep up there. I always think that at least in both of the departments I worked in, I thought we had good jurisdictional relationships.
Mm-hmm.
But every now and then you can still get a little bump. Okay? You get a bump. But I feel very good that two places I work, we tried to work together. And that's good. But when I also did a lot of teaching in police work during my time in the police department. I did a lot of teaching, which means I spent a lot of times researching stuff and going to a lot of conferences. And there were other places, oh no, they were at war.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, we're looking back at it from all these years, but we don't even know how well these were working together. Were they getting along? I will go back to the very first murder when we did the very first one with Mary Frazier, correct? That was probably that was just brutal enough that was probably a shock to the senses. Now, yes, 2 years has passed, but this is the third one.
Yeah.
That's still a shock to the senses.
Right.
Because all depending on your jurisdiction, there's, and I want to put it in perspective of jurisdictional kind of background. There are officers who work in big cities that within their first 2 days may go and help. Not much they could do at 2 days, but at least participate in the investigation of a murder. There's places like that.
Right.
There's other places that you could spend 25 years there and not have a murder in your community. Okay. Now, that's just a fact. Does that make that officer that only experienced 0 or 1 murder less of an investigator? No.
Mhm.
They may have been great in something else. That just didn't happen in their area,
Mhm.
you know? And I'll use a weird example: automobile accidents. The average automobile accident is easy to investigate. Okay. Once somebody goes through training, get cut loose from their field training officer, they're expected to work an automobile accident. Okay. Great. From day one that they're let loose. Okay. And automobile accidents can be easy to investigate until they're not. And when they're not, they are disastrous.
Right.
People die. There's questions about speed, questions about who was driving. And it took a while in Newport News. We were a bigger area that we finally actually had specialists to do accidents. Okay. Because
Mhm.
everybody was like, oh, wow. And they weren't every day, maybe not even every month. Okay. But when
Mhm.
you had one, you had one. Okay. And those specialty guys went to specialty schools, just did all this extra stuff. We had to buy them equipment, buy them training, do all of these things. And when something happened, you sent the big guys or gals out there to do it, right?
Mhm.
Did
Mhm.
a marvelous job. I probably was on the department 15 years before we realized that was a good idea. 10 or 15 years before
Right.
somebody went, probably need to have some specialists working these really bad ones.
Right.
Okay. And the guys were on the ship. I do believe that people were even called in at times if it was bad enough.
Mhm.
So it's one of those things where police departments learn, police departments grow. It doesn't mean, and this is where my whole point is, it doesn't mean that the average officer was a bad accident investigator. They were
Mhm.
excellent until it got crazy. And
Right.
they had to bring in the big guns. Okay.
Mhm.
Murder is that times 100. Okay.
Yeah.
You have tons of great officers. Okay. But if you've never worked a murder, it is not like you work anything else. Then you get into these complicated situations like we've discussed, and it's a whole different game. So you're having all of this happen multi-jurisdictional. You may or may not had officers who had dealt with this before. And once you bring in people and you set up a lot of these, what you'll call task force, a lot of times, they do a great job, but they're also building behind the 8 ball because time has passed.
Mhm.
And I think that's what you got kind of going on here with there. That's not an insult to the guys in there. There were other things. They might have been outstanding, better than I've ever been. But if you haven't worked murders before and you haven't worked the type of murders that were occurring here, it's a wholly different game. And I think that's one of the things with these three that you really got. And the average murder, most people know who did it. We now have 3 legitimate whodunits.
Yeah.
We have 3 very strange situations. And with Mixer, I want to point this one out. We actually had a name, David Johnson, right?
Yep.
We had a name. And we know because during this time, Collins had a falling out with a lot of his frat brothers because of his thievery
Yeah.
and his other bad behaviors. And one of these people was David Johnson.
Yeah.
I mean, I would call that a click. That's all I'm saying. Yet we are not going to get lost on that today. But when we re-examine, that didn't seem to have a lot of clout. To me, that was a big deal.
Yeah.
In the beginning that we talked about. And yet it seemed like that wasn't a big deal when the case went to court and started getting with Gary and stuff. One interesting thing is that a lot of people, I do believe, including the dad, if I read this correctly,
Mhm.
believe the boyfriend did it. And here's the deal with that. That is a normal situation. We had mentioned that earlier. That is a traditional situation that he would be looked at.
Yeah.
Regardless of the fact that he didn't let her use the car and the ramifications of what that meant.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, let's not play. I mean, he made a decision, and the ramifications were horrifying.
Big time.
Okay. I think that's why the dad for a while kept on thinking it was him. But I can understand the dad's anger, and that probably clouded some judgment.
Mhm.
With that said, I think that as we build on this and we talk about it and we get through the minutia on some of it, you get straight back to, yes, if you had been looking at this before Gary was involved, everybody thought this was part of the murders cycle that was occurring for those 3 years.
Yeah, what I wanted to discuss was 3 things. Okay, so one is the differences that law enforcement was looking at to think why this wasn't part of the case in which eventually convicted Gary Leiterman. Secondarily, the similarities that they discount or don't acknowledge, you know. And then the third is the coincidences that run through it with John Norman Collins' involvement, right? So the first one were the similarities. So, or did I say differences first?
The differences was first.
Okay, so the differences are specifically that this is the first time, okay, remember there's only been 2 others. The first one was picked up where she was kind of walking and somebody that she knew pulled up and then she disappeared. So that one, she was out walking and it was a ride issue. And it's still a ride issue, though we don't know whether she got in the car voluntarily.
But it was a ride.
Right, but it was a ride. The second one was for sure a ride because she got in the car with 3 guys. One of them we believe to be John McCall.
Right.
And 2 other ones being frat brothers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the third one, Miss Mixer, it is a ride issue, but it's a ride issue where she posted on a ride board and it's at the University of Michigan. So they're trying to say the other 2 were Eastern Michigan University people from basically from that field, whatever it's called, services building. Mm-hmm. And it lived pretty close to John Norman Collins. So those 2 are different than Jane Mixer. But what I had surmised, and this is just my thesis that I'm putting forward, is maybe that David Johnson is a coincidence. Okay, and we'll get to the coincidence side of it. But say Jane Mixer, the guy doesn't come to pick her up. So I've been to that law quad, and it's kind of like an Ivy League. It is an Ivy League school. It's not kind of like an Ivy League school, and it's like Yale. You know, it's got the Gothic buildings around, and it's a total square. It's enclosed square, and upstairs is where the living facilities are, and you'd have to go down and then go through the quad and go outside, and then there's the road that runs in between the law quad and the actual student services building. So Jane Mixer could be sitting on the curb waiting for her ride, and John Norman Collins or somebody else comes by, and it's an opportunity.
Right.
Maybe it was a coincidence that David Johnson, being a frat brother of John Norman Collins' name, happened to come up in this case. So maybe that is just a red herring type thing, that she was sitting on the curb and John Norman Collins is riding through the fraternity house, though the University of Michigan side of it was kitty cornered from the student union. So it was close in 1969. The actual fraternity house that he was kicked out of. Okay, now he was in the Ypsilanti, Eastern Michigan version of that. But another coincidence, if you want to call it that.
Let me ask you, because again, with the Michigan layout, how far is Eastern Michigan and Michigan?
It's about 6 miles apart, I think.
Okay, 6 miles. Okay, I think that's important for everybody to remember, because I think there's a tendency to think the 2 schools, like it's 2 different colleges, so they have to be far. No, that's 6 miles. They're on.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, University of Michigan, and I don't know how big it was in 69, but it almost encompasses all of Ann Arbor.
Right. Right.
I mean, it's got a medical school, it's got a law school, various different ones, but it's that you drive through Ann Arbor and it is University of Michigan, just about.
I think you're at that stage too, where when you're talking, I think the 6 mile radius is important to remember, because also I am sure, even though everybody was proud of their school.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sure everybody that went to Michigan thought that they were a little different. I'll just leave it at that in the beginning.
Right. So they're saying that, and when I say they, law enforcement thinks that the modus operandi was different because this one took more planning. This wasn't just a victim of opportunity, I guess you would call it.
Yeah. I've always kind of thought when they said that, though, that was the next level. Now, let me go back to the 6 mile radius. Again, everybody's proud of their school, but some people may have been more proud than others. Okay. But here's the deal. They interacted. Okay. That's not a quantum leap to think they interacted or that they would have realized somebody came from another school. Okay. They had access to that. I think the planning part of it is only a step up. I really do. I have always believed when we discussed this, and that's came up before, is, driving around looking for somebody to get a ride and driving a few miles to go look to see if somebody's looking for a ride is not a quantum leap. Okay. Mm-hmm. Because what you really were doing was manipulating space and time. That was what people were doing. And all you're really looking for is to get somebody in the car.
Right.
So I've always kind of thought that was the greatest of leaps.
Yeah.
Actually, planning gets overrated.
Mm-hmm.
I'm driving around. I'm not seeing anything at Eastern Michigan. I know enough to mess around with the jurisdictions that maybe I need to go somewhere else. I drive in. I go look to where everybody puts up, well, I need a ride. I see Jane needs a ride. She meets all my criteria right now because she's a female. Mm-hmm. I hate David Johnson. That's the name I'm going to give. And lo and behold, right. I mean, I don't think we're talking about a master plan, people.
Yeah, right.
I don't think we're thinking great thinker here. I think it's another time of just being able to manipulate your surroundings. Mm-hmm. And I think that if we could take a break and get away from Mixer for a second and then start talking about crime, mm-hmm. I think sometimes we say planning as if there's some master plan. Mm-hmm. Where actually what most people do is manipulate a situation. Okay. And as I said, I don't think there's any great planning in what I said. You just know you might want to change jurisdiction. You don't see what you're looking for in Eastern Michigan anymore. You drive down the road a few miles, you know where somebody's at. Mm-hmm. You know that you got to do is make a phone call. You give that guy his name and boom, she's out there for you. There's no great planning to that. There's no mastermind to that. Sure. You go back to your scenario, which I also think is plausible. The David Johnson thing's maybe a red herring, maybe it's not. Let's say it is. She's sitting there waiting for a ride. He thinks everybody, maybe he's got an eye on Eastern Michigan. Everybody's a little uptight. He can't find anybody. He drives 6 miles and lo and behold, she's sitting on a suitcase.
Right. That's my thought, but it's just a thought.
No, but it's a realistic thought because the thing of it is that you make perceptions that she got picked up by the person that said that she was going to get picked up. right. And that's just, they got a name, And
by the way, no David Johnson was ever found.
Yeah.
No David Johnson was ever found. They traced 20, 30 of them they couldn't find.
Yeah. So I think there is this realistic thing of saying, we don't know she got picked. We got a name. To make a quantum leap to the next one is not something I'd be willing to do. And again, she's sitting on the side of the road. She's on her suitcase. Both of those situations are not planning. That's my real point. If he did do the setup and call and say, hey, I'll pick you up, mm-hmm. or he just drives through, there's not a master plan there. It's manipulating a situation.
Right.
Okay. And it's all
So,
about getting people into the car.
right. So I'll jump over because it's more similar than different. But where she was killed was not determined.
Correct.
Okay. And I'm not sure in the first two they ever determined where those two women were ever killed. So that's more of a similarity than a difference.
Right.
But where she was dropped off, the first two were at abandoned farms, right? So she was dropped off at a cemetery. Okay. So they're saying that that's different. Okay. It wasn't at an abandoned farm.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a corridor where these abandoned farms were that evidently they liked to, whoever liked to drop it, and they called it the Geddes Road. Mm-hmm. And I forget what the other road name was. Corridor. Okay. And it was kind of northeast of Ypsilanti. So just keep that in your mind. But so she was dropped at this Denton cemetery. Okay. And it was on the backside of the cemetery where there were a few houses. And she was laid on her back. And what they say, and it's going to come into play in the Gary Leiterman case, in the rape position, which I'm not sure what this rape position is because she was not raped, for one.
Right.
But it comes into play in Gary's case and in a big way. Mm-hmm. But she was not sexually assaulted that they know of. Okay. She was not brutalized, mm-hmm. but her pantyhose were pulled down, mm-hmm. and her private area was exposed. Mm-hmm. And I'll get to my thought on that in a minute. Mm-hmm. Her face was covered with her raincoat. Okay. And psychologically, and I'm not a profiler, and I don't think Joe is either, law enforcement thought that either the person knew the victim or it didn't fit the fantasy of whatever the killer wanted to do. So they're saying all this is different because the first two were brutalized, no doubt about that. And the first one, no sign of rape because the body was in such bad shape, right? But we could surmise that they did because they came back and moved the body. Either they, him, or animals moved the first body. So there's that. So they're saying that it's different because of the place of the body. It's way out, supposedly, in Wayne County, away from the other, I don't know what word you'd use, adjective, but the cluster of where the murders were found. But we already said that one up way north was way off the charts anyway. She was 23. She was a co-ed, similar to the other two, but she was University of Michigan. The first two were Eastern Michigan University. So there's similarity or differences there. So what do you got to say about that, Joe? Anything?
I think that, we're going to get into some of the other victims and you're going to see some bigger difference than that. That's always been my 13. Somebody that was a police.
13 years old, 150 feet from her house.
Yeah, and somebody else who was just having some issues with substance abuse, and she was a police informant.
Yeah.
I think sometimes people want to see what they want to see. I think the similarities are bigger. We know that she was not taken to there first. That's probably not where she was killed.
Yeah.
We'll get into where we think she was killed later.
Yeah. Yep.
Which brings it more into focus with it being college. But here's the problem is I think there's this whole, he didn't sexually assault her. And I think this is a good point that to focus on, and I'm going to try to be polite. Okay. And I want to clarify that because I think people think everybody's the same. First off, his ability to physically perform may or may not have happened, and that could happen for several different reasons. And to pretend that that's not an element, that his inability to perform couldn't have affected that, is naive. Okay.
Yes.
That is just being blunt and I'm being polite. Okay.
Mhm.
His inability to perform for whatever reason could have been there. And you can't blow that off. Okay.
Mhm.
Number two, we do not know if he was not interrupted. Okay. In other words, because Collins isn't a talker or they didn't have any information, they probably have about as much information as we do right now talking about it at the time. Right.
Right. Right.
We do not know if he was not interrupted. Now, let me
Mhm.
clarify what that means. There's nothing that says that he did not want to do it, but because of some interrupter, he didn't.
Mhm.
Now, he abducted her. He's going to kill her.
Yeah.
Okay. So, whatever fantasy he had of what he wanted to do, both could have been interfered with by A, his ability to perform for whatever reason at that time,
Mhm.
two, an interrupter that caused that not to occur, but he still had to eliminate her.
Yeah.
Now, there is a sexual overtone because I was under the impression that many of his victims were put in the position of what they call the rape position, which is actually, to be honest with you, in a position where her legs are spread.
Yeah. On her back. Yep. I think
That would be
most of them were, as my understanding also.
So,
My understanding was also.
yeah, and I think there were other victims like that. Because what you're trying to not get lost in is the sexual act. And again, I'm being polite, and I hope everybody understands that. And I probably overstep my boundaries with some people, anyways.
Mhm.
There's still a sexual overtone to this. Just by the way she's presented.
Yeah.
So when you say, "Hey, she wasn't sexually assaulted," don't make this quantum leap that wasn't what that person desired, because there's sexual overtone all over this. Okay.
Mhm.
But don't forget his inability to perform could have been there. Number two, he could have been interrupted. Or number three, and you brought this up when we first started talking about
Mhm.
it, just makes a choice not to do it. That for some reason she said something, did something, and he lost interest in that part. And I think that those three things have to be looked at. Okay.
Mhm.
And not to repeat them or try to be, brutal about it, but those three things have to be looked at. Okay. Maybe she just said something, did something about her. That just didn't seem like it was going to go to that level.
Right.
Interrupters, his inabilities. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those are all very realistic because you can't sit there and go, it's not a sexual crime in the sense of that's how he presents her.
Mhm.
Because what you don't have, he picks her up, he kills her, he dumps her on the side of the road. He dumps her in there. It's a staged, she looks like
Yeah.
that. So I still think that we have to be real careful about making these judgments that everything has to be exactly the same or they go there, or not realizing that there has been people that have committed sexual assaults and then they've been different, and at one point or another something happened in
Right.
which wasn't finished. And I'm not picking which one I think that is. I'm just saying you have to bring those three things into play before you say that's an incredible difference.
Right.
And I'm a big believer in this one, and I'm going to go to number two, which is the interrupter. That something occurred to interrupt it.
Mhm.
That through some sort of momentum of the moment, that wasn't able to take it to that level. Okay,
Mhm.
and that doesn't mean he didn't want to, and it didn't stop him that when the murder was done and completed, that he didn't present her that way. So
Right.
it's not saying that I know that. I just know those three things exist.
Mhm.
Okay. And we really we don't know. It's out there. But to sit there and go, oh well, he was able to do this on the other times. Well, all situations are not the same. All
Right.
situations are not equal. Okay. We make the assumption that the first person was sexually assaulted. We make that assumption. But if
Yeah.
you go back and you watch that first issue, I said, don't do that.
Yeah, right.
That first episode on her, Frazier, I said, don't do that.
Right.
Okay. But we have a tendency, and even when we do our meetings, we you and I both,
Yeah.
this perception that she was,
Yeah.
but we don't know that.
We don't.
And
No evidence.
you know, we're trying to do a little bit of everything. Yeah, you have to speculate, but sometimes you got to bring it all to the front of what you do there. I think when we get back next week, we'll go into a little bit more detail and talk a little bit more about where she may have been taken to next week.
Yeah. But before we go, let's talk about, okay, the one thing that was left was she wasn't brutalized. Okay. And I don't know whether you say being shot twice in the head and strangled is not brutalized.
I'm not sure what that one means. And I'm going to be honest with you about the not being brutalized. She was not brutalized as much as some of the others. But for our viewers, when we go through this, you're going to start to realize that the person after this was brutalized way more than anybody else, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
And I think you're beginning to split hairs when you say that they were strangled and shot in the head as being not as brutal. And again,
First was 30 stab wounds and the second was like 27. So don't forget that. This one wasn't stabbed, but I think both of those had an additional attempt at cause of death, or could have been death. Okay, one was stabbed and strangled, the other one was stabbed and strangled, whatever.
Right. And I think that, and you're going to find out, and I don't want to be a spoiler alert here, you're going to find out that the gun was used again. Okay. But here's the deal. It goes back to interrupters, the inability to do what you did before.
Right.
We don't know that. Okay. And I'm going to be honest with you. We're talking about if we pin this on one person or we pin this on two people or many people. Whatever the atmosphere of is why they took them, including the limitation of time.
Mm-hmm.
Might explain why somebody didn't do what they did. Because maybe you took them to a place where you really didn't want them to bleed.
Yeah. Okay. And just to tee it up for next week, though, okay, so she was shot in the head with a .22, okay? In James's book, Catching Serial Killers, John Norman Collins and another person stole either the night of the murder or the day before a .22 from a house right out there by that cemetery. Okay. We didn't talk about our coincidences. We're not going to have time to talk about them this time, but I'm just throwing that out there.
Right. And I want to talk about where we may, and on the next time, I want us to discuss that and where we think she may have ended up with her, which would have explained some of the lack of brutality.
Well, that was the second thing that I wanted to mention. So she was strangled with a nylon, okay? And that nylon was for a woman that was 6 foot tall, okay? Now, John Norman Collins' uncle's wife was 6 foot tall. Yeah. In that nylon that was on the neck of the victim, there were granules of laundry detergent. And we'll wait to get to that, but those are critical issues that when you start thinking the similarities and the differences and the coincidences, you're going to come up with probably the same way we have. We hope, or maybe not. I mean, we're still trying to lay it out. Right. This is 1969. Okay, there is a drop of blood found on Miss Mixer's hand. Okay, that's going to be critical and crucial in Gary Leiterman's case. Supposedly there are sweat marks or sweat on Miss Mixer that survives 35 years. We'll get to that too. But I just wanted to lay that out, that those are the critical things that I was trying to get to in the similarities and the differences. And then when we get to the coincidences, and Joe, what do you think in law enforcement about coincidences? It's probably the same, I think, in the legal world, right?
Right. Yeah. There's no coincidence.
There are no coincidences.
There are no coincidences. And I'm going to tell you something, and I don't want to go in there because we don't want to open it up because it's another episode.
True that.
Before we discuss this, we may actually have to have 2 or 3 on Mixer because of this.
Yeah.
If you ever watch this, and I watched it because I have to, because I actually go through all of this, and I realize I have catchphrases. And and so do you. We all have catch, and I watch other people who all have catchphrases. One of mine on this particular episodes of true crime is space and time, because I believe in it.
Yeah.
I'm just absolutely believe in space and time. Where you're at that moment is going to dictate what you do.
Right.
I think for the people that want to know why they weren't stabbed 30 times, right? If you begin to see what we put together here, you're going to understand why she wasn't.
Yeah.
Because he did not want that kind of residue in the house.
Yeah.
I'll leave it. I mean, like I said, I know we all got our little catchphrases, and mine on this one is space and time. And I don't mind because you're hearing a lot because I believe in it. You do, everybody, even good stuff, you do with what you have at that very moment. That's what you react to.
Yeah. And talking about space and time. So this is the 3rd murder, but it escalates, okay? From this murder, 2 days later, they brutalize absolutely beyond the scope of any other victim
that they did.
And then he goes on a rampage.
Right.
For the next, so this is March. By July, he has killed 6 more people, at least. The law enforcement thinks he may have killed 30 up to 100. He leaves bodies on his way to California and back.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a trigger. If you watched our other episodes, and I encourage you to do it, the last one, Shell, that we talked about.
Yeah.
Their inability to do anything with John Norris Collins because they talked to him and just let him go, basically.
Yeah.
Triggers all of this. And after this situation with Mixer, it just turns into a nightmare.
Yeah.
That's why you got to see it all when we go.
Yeah.
We encourage everybody to leave comments. We thank you when you do. Hit the like button, subscribe, do whatever you got to do for us. We're really taking it serious. We know we got some listeners that listen all the time, and I want to thank them personally. We do appreciate that. And do it here. And we'll be back next week with another episode of Two Average Chat.
Already.
We'll see you later, and
see ya.